I didn't think a mailbox could start a war. I figured it was a quiet swap. Retire the rusted tin on my townhome's brick column and install a sturdy unit that didn't shed paint flakes every time I opened it. The first clue that I had stepped into something bigger came on a humid morning when a clipboard hovered at the end of my walkway. A neighbor in a sun visor counted, wrote a number, and pressed her lips into a line that said everything I needed to know about where this was headed. Within a week, that count turned into a list, and that list turned into a campaign. I had just stumbled into a homeowners association drama I never asked for. The hook that kept me awake was a fear of mail theft or lost packages. It was a promise that by tomorrow afternoon, a committee would walk the property and tag every non-approved box for rectification. That was their word, not mine. Rectification sounded like a surgical procedure. It also sounded like they wanted to erase any trace that our street had personality, history, or even common sense. The threat was simple: comply or pay, and the board's deadline was less than a day away. I stood on my stoop and tried to breathe with the cicadas buzzing in the trees as the afternoon sun turned the brick a deeper red. The visor, the clipboard, the tally, they burned into my head until I started pulling files from the old binder in my utility closet. I wasn't ready to pick a fight, but I was ready to stop being counted like contraband. What I found in those papers would become my lever, my shield, and eventually my wedge. It wouldn't be a brawl at first. It would be a drip, a pester, a public shaming in polite tones. But I was already picturing the moment this story turns, when the same list that aimed to humiliate us becomes a proof that the enforcers never had their house in order. That hint of justice kept me in the game. Alder Row is a tidy ring of townhomes tucked behind a line of poplars and a brick sign that welcomes people who have a certain taste for order. The association prides itself on consistency. Matching shutters, coordinated door colors, and a landscaping contract that keeps the hedges squared off like a parade ground. It's the kind of place where bins must be stored out of sight, where holiday lights have a shelf life, and where the newsletter reads like a cross between a garden club memo and a parking citation. On good days, that order makes life easy. On bad days, that order becomes a weapon. The mailbox rule sits in a section of our covenants, conditions, and restrictions that most people skim past. I had skimmed it too. The page flag in my binder was old and curled, but it still pointed to what I needed. CCR Section 4.3, the mailbox rule. It specified dimensions, placement relative to the brick column, and an approved pallet from a style sheet dated more than a decade ago. That sheet referenced a manufacturer that no longer existed and a finish labeled Oxide Bronze No. 12, which, best I could tell, had been discontinued sometime around the last major paper phone book. It wasn't that the rule mandated vintage charm. It mandated a dead product line. The purists, as I came to think of them, used that dead specification like scripture. They wanted to enforce the style sheet, even if the company that made the part didn't. They organized themselves around a neighbor I'll call Ms. V, whose sun visor matched her posture. Crisp, elevated, unyielding. She framed the issue as preservation, as an effort to keep Alder Row's look intact. But preservation became pretext the moment she started taking photos of posts, hinges, and paint chips, then tallying boxes like trophies. I only saw snippets at first. A spreadsheet on a tablet during a cul-de-sac chat, a tally scratched on a legal pad, and lines in a monthly board agenda that hinted at an upcoming enforcement walkthrough. When the agenda arrived in our HOA portal, I read the excerpt 3 times, then saved it. That board agenda excerpt would become my second prop. The line was bland. Committee to conduct conformity review of street furniture per CCR Section 4.3. Street furniture. That meant our mailboxes, our house numbers, our little fixtures of daily life. I learned the pace of the board cycle. Notices posted a month out, then escalations, then walkthroughs, then citations. The treasurer liked process. The secretary liked records. The vice president liked rules. The president liked not having her hands dirty. The committee chair liked to be admired by the purists. I could feel the choreography setting in. The purists would do the counting. The board would do the signing. The management company would do the mailing. And neighbors like me would stand at our brick columns wondering how a $45 paint job became a $450 fine. The fine, of course, already had a date. It came later as part of the avalanche. referenced under Bylaw 3.7, and dated August 2nd. I didn't know that yet, but I could feel its outline forming. The association always leaves a paper trail, like a snail leaves a shine. All it would take was one person to gather the pieces into a single bright line. On the evening the agenda went live. The sky leveled into the color of a dime, and porch lights clicked on one by one like a quiet drumline. I stood there with my binder open to CCR section 4.3 and my phone open to the agenda page. The rule was older than some of the shrubs out front. The agenda phrasing was colder than the evening breeze. The feeling inside me was not fear. It was a stubborn little seed of future satisfaction. Like I could already hear the moment a gavel hits the table and the purists have to swallow their pride. The first dispute started so small it barely sounded like conflict. Mailboxes became a way to count people, not boxes. A list circulated of rogue units that had deviated from the style sheet. A modern lock here, a slightly deeper arch there, a slot cut for small parcels, because everyone now orders things that never fit in a standard slot. The list included my replacement, which matched our brick column and mailbox cap, but came with newer latch design. Newer meant non-compliant in their minds. It didn't matter that my unit was safe or weather-tight, and not an eyesore. Ms. V's tally morphed into a map. Each dot marked a house, each dot color-coded for fully compliant, minor variance, or non-conforming. I saw it in a photo she posted to a private thread that everyone knows isn't really private. The kind of place where residents believe they're whispering but are actually shouting. The dots created a story they like to tell. Standard was slipping, character was eroding, and the committee would save us all from a drift into visual chaos. I suppose that narrative is tidy if you never look too hard at the facts. The facts look like this. The original manufacturer was gone. The finish was gone. The measurements didn't match current postal guidance, and the height standard was tied to an obsolete curb spec. The association had never updated the spec sheet to accommodate reality. That was the weakness. And weaknesses are where leverage hides. I walked the loop at dusk, slow enough to look without being obvious, fast enough that I didn't look like I was casing the place. I counted hinges, arches, flag shapes, and mounting plates. I made notes on my phone, dodging sprinklers that clicked in rhythm across the lawns. Crickets rasped in the hedges. A dog chain clinked once and then quieted. Most replacements were tasteful and in the spirit of the originals, if not the letter. In other words, our street still looked like Alder Row, not a hardware store aisle. That gap between spirit and letter mattered, and I knew I'd need to articulate it without turning into the very thing I hated, a lecture with a fine stapled to it. The first official sign of trouble arrived as a brightly worded bulletin. It framed the walkthrough as an act of care, a tune-up for the aesthetic that drew buyers here. It offered a gentle reminder to review all fixtures against approved designs. The bulletin was polite until the last paragraph, which mentioned escalating measures for repeated noncompliance. That tone shifted the air on the street. Neighbors stiffened when they passed the committee chair. Conversations got clipped. The breeze carried a different edge. I felt the edge the moment a laminated tag appeared on my column. Review pending. It wasn't a fine, not yet. It was a public mark, placed at eye level for anyone walking their dog to see. A small plastic sign with a big message. This was a performance. The committee didn't just want conformity. They wanted conformity under applause. They had a stage, and we were the props. My binder, my agenda excerpt, and my photos weren't just documents now. They were anchors. I added a new tab and labeled it with a date, August 2nd. It wasn't August yet, but I knew that date would matter. I'd felt it when I saw how their schedule lined up with the next board vote and how the management company processed citations at month's end. The association was a machine. I had to become a mechanic. I needed to understand what gave them the confidence to tag a dozen homes in a week. It wasn't just a rule. It was the assumption that no one would challenge the rule's internal contradictions. That's how petty power grows. It banks on silence. I wasn't going to give them silence. I was going to give them a record. I started building a timeline. I logged the day Ms. V counted at my corner. I logged the bulletin date. I logged the appearance of the laminated tag. I snapped my own photos of older, grandfather boxes that the purists ignored because those owners were aligned with them socially. The pattern was obvious. Enforcement wasn't neutral. It was selective. The purists were applying a museum label to the homes they liked and a hazard label to the ones they didn't. The second week brought a new tool to their theater, a clipboard audit at dawn. They moved in pairs and jotted notes before commuters pulled out. It gave their list an aura of officialdom. The board loved that kind of ritual. It made volunteers feel like deputies. But deputies need law, and law needs clarity. CCR Section 4.3 was not clear. It was obsolete and vague, a bad combination, and the purists were using the vagueness like a wedge. I pushed back the only way that fit the rules. I filed an information request through the management portal for the style sheet's original approval vote and any subsequent addenda. I referenced CCR Section 4.3, cited the board agenda excerpt by date, and asked for manufacturer documentation. I kept my tone clinical and boring. People who thrive on performance hate being forced to perform paperwork. Within a few days, the portal spat out a PDF packet. That packet became my third prop. It contained a photocopy of the style sheet with a stamp from 12 years ago and a typed footnote added 6 years later that referred to suppliers subject to availability. There it was. 6 years ago, the board had acknowledged that the original vendor might not exist forever, and they had said replacement should match to the extent practicable. Practicable. That word was going to be my crowbar. As I assembled the packet with its footnote, I tucked in a printout of the Postal Service's current height guidance for curbside and wall-mounted boxes, highlighted where our old spec conflicted. I wasn't aiming to embarrass anyone, at least not yet. I was aiming to create a path the board could walk that didn't leave them face down. If they wanted a way to say they were preserving our look while accepting the reality of new parts, I provided. The purists didn't pause. They posted a new tally and congratulated themselves for progress toward uniformity. The committee chair scheduled the walkthrough for tomorrow, 2 p.m., rain or shine. My tag stayed on the brick, plastic winking in the late light. The walkthrough wasn't just an inspection. It was a countdown. They promised rectification. And they meant it literally. They would order us back to a rectangle of choices from a dead catalog. The air changed again that night. The street lights hummed faintly, a long electric sigh, while I sat at my kitchen table. I opened my binder and smoothed the pages until the tabs lay flat. The packet with the practicable footnote sat on top. I added a cover sheet with my address, unit number, and a header, variance request, archival design context. I wasn't going to ask for a random exception. I was going to ask for the association to recognize its own history, to allow a design that existed in our archival photos from the first years of Alder Row, one that my replacement closely matched even if manufacturer's model number had changed. That's the trick with people who worship paper. You win by finding the right paper. This is where the first real spark of retaliation formed, though it wasn't visible yet. It felt like the first pull on a stuck drawer. The drawer gives a little, and you know you'll get open with 2 more tries. Tomorrow's committee walkthrough would be one of those pulls. The second would come when their confidence met my footnote. Tomorrow's walkthrough is supposed to erase every non-approved box, but the word practicable buried in their own records could force them to swallow the tags and rewrite the rule. If I can show my design as the association's own past, not a rogue present. I had one more choice to make before I slept. Do I leave the laminated tag for everyone to see and risk that neighbors start to assume guilt by display, or do I remove it and risk being accused of tampering? I left it, let it glare in the porch light, like a badge pinned on by a hall monitor. The purists wanted an audience. I could use one too. If this was going to be a public tally, I could turn public into pressure. I set my alarm early to print the archival photos that management once shared in a centennial-themed newsletter. In the bottom corner, one image. The original mailbox shape sat on a brick column indistinguishable from mine except for the curve of the lid. My replacement lid matched that curve. I circled it. I added a note. Archival design, Alder Row Year 1. It was quiet work, neat work, the kind that calmed me even as the stakes rose. If they wanted to play clerk, I could play historian. I knew the risk. If they decided to make an example of someone, they'd pick an owner who could be labeled stubborn or careless. I didn't want that to be me. I wanted to be the owner who followed the rules better than they did, the one who quoted their own footnotes back to them until they had a nod. I didn't need to be liked. I needed to be correct. Morning came with a soft gray light over the roofs and a smell of wet mulch from last night's sprinklers. I set out the packet, the style sheet with the practicable footnote, the agenda excerpt, and the archival photo. I tucked a copy of the postal guideline behind them like a quiet trump card. If they pushed, I would point to safety compliance, not just aesthetics. I wasn't trying to make enemies. I was trying to make the path of least resistance lead through me. By noon, neighbors were watching through blinds. A few stood in driveways, arms folded, trying to look casual. The air had that charged feeling it gets before a summer storm, even though the radar was clear. The committee gathered at the entrance. The chair, Ms. V with the visor, 2 other purists in matching polos, and a board liaison clutching a clipboard. They moved like a flock and murmured as they approached the first tag column. They didn't come to my place first, which was a gift. I watched the choreography 2 homes ahead. They paused, compared a photo on the clipboard to the real thing, and scribbled notes. The liaison peeled a new tag from a stack and pressed it onto the brick. The neighbor at that unit stepped out and stood with hands behind their back, as if this were a performance that might end in applause. It didn't. The committee moved on. The tag shone like a small accusation. When they reached my column, I stepped out with my packet. No speeches. No heat. I handed the liaison a copy and said, in my blandest narration voice inside my head, that my unit matched archival photos, that the original manufacturer was defunct, and that CCR Section 4.3 had been amended by footnote to consider availability and practicability. The liaison took the packet. The chair looked at the visor. The visor looked at my lid curve like it was a crime. The board liaison said they would note my materials for review. That phrase meant nothing and everything. It meant they heard me. It meant they could still ignore me. The laminated tag stayed. The clipboard scribbled. The committee moved on. But my materials moved with them now, into their bundle, into the folder that would land on the board table. I pictured the treasurer flipping through and frowning at the footnote he had probably forgotten existed. I pictured the vice president testing the word practicable in her mouth and considering whether it sounded like a retreat or a compromise. I pictured the president deciding if she wanted to fight at the next open meeting or a quick adoption of a clarification no one would read closely. I pictured the purists realizing that the paper they worshiped was not as sharp as they thought. A neighbor texted me that afternoon with a photo of my laminated tag glinting in the sunlight like a warning beacon. I texted back a photo of the archival image with the original lid curve circled in red. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The quiet spread. A handful of owners who had been on the purist list started asking for the practicable footnote, like it was a secret handshake. It wasn't a mutiny. It was something simpler and slower, a refusal to be performed upon without a script of our own. As the committee looped back toward the entrance, the board liaison slipped my packet into a folder with a color tab. I saw the color, and I filed away in my head. Colored tabs at board meetings meant prioritized items. Prioritized items meant votes. Votes meant paper. Paper meant leverage. The daylight softened. The hum of the streetlights grew, and the cicadas rose again in the trees. The visor tilted toward the last tag column, and then upright again as if satisfied with a day's harvest. They'd marked their territory. They believed the rest was inevitable. Letters, fines, and a line in the next newsletter celebrating renewed conformity. They'd have their applause. They always did, until they didn't. I stood at the curb and let the scene settle. The smell of cut grass lingering, the faint clink of a gate latch, the soft thud of a package at a doorstep down the row. I'd set the hook I needed for what comes next, and it didn't require me to shout. It required me to force the board to reconcile its old style sheet with its own footnote, and with the reality that postal guidance had shifted. If they wanted conformity, they could have it updated, documented, and achievable. If they wanted punishment, I was ready to hold up their paper and ask them to read it out loud. The deadline that had sounded like a guillotine now sounded like a drum I could march to. Tomorrow's committee walkthrough wasn't just a threat. It was a stage. They wanted a show. I could give them one they didn't plan for. The day after the walkthrough, the street felt like a stage after curtain fell. Props still in place, whispers in the aisles. Nothing official landed that morning, which meant the committee's paperwork was traveling through the invisible gears. I watched the mail truck like a clock hand and kept working behind the scenes. I gathered side-by-side photos. My replacement lid curve against the archival curve. The obsolete oxide bronze number 12 swatched next to a modern finish that matched it so closely only a magnifying glass in bad faith could tell them apart. I printed 2 sets, slid them into plastic sleeves, and labeled them with dates. I added a line at the bottom that referenced the practicable footnote. Small, factual, calm. By lunchtime, a new bulletin appeared in the portal. A compliance sweep memo with a July 20th timestamp. It confirmed what the visor had been counting toward. Letters would be issued in batches. Courtesy tags replaced by formal notices. The memo dressed it as consistency, but the edge was unmistakable. I saved the PDF and highlighted the sentence that said, members may seek variances where manufacturer availability prevents exact match. It was the same idea as the footnote, but here it was in a fresh skin. I slid the memo into my binder under escalation. The wind nudged the hedges, and a dry leaf skittered across the brick like a small warning. Neighbors started comparing notes in low, careful tones. Most didn't want to fight. They wanted out. A few tried to repaint or swap hinges in a rush, hoping to dodge a letter. The purists stood back and watched, triumphant without saying a word. They believed the wave was theirs. I believed the wave was about to hit a sandbar I'd built from paper. 2 days later, the envelope came. It was cream stock with the management company's logo and the association's return address. Inside, a notice of nonconformity flagged Bylaw 3.7 and the mailbox spec under CCR Section 4.3. The letter was dated July 25th, an opening salvo, a deadline to rectify by August 1st, a warning that fines may be assessed on August 2nd. It included a photo of my box with a red outline around the lid curve, as if the curve itself were an act of defiance. I logged the date, scanned the letter, and placed it in escalation with a sticky note. Timeline, July 25th, August 1st, August 2nd. I filed my variance request the same afternoon. I kept the language measured, almost dull. Manufacturer discontinued. Archival match. Postal guidance alignment. Practicable standard met. I included the board agenda excerpt, the compliance sweep memo, the footnote, and the archival photo. I requested an archival design variance. Not a free-for-all. My ask was narrow by design. When people fear a flood, you build a channel, not a lake. The following week became a study in selective enforcement. Homes aligned with the purists received friendly reminders, while others, like mine, received the full paper treatment. I kept walking at dusk and noticed the tags disappearing from certain columns while lingering on others. One unit with a visibly off-color box, brighter and shinier than anything on the street, lost its tag overnight. Another unit with a subtle curve like mine kept its tag and gained a second sticker that read, pending escalation. The pattern hardened. Not taste, not safety, politics. The board scheduled a special session to vote on a round of fines for unresolved items. The agenda listed mailboxes, CCR Section 4.3, status and actions. I knew my variance would be reviewed just before that vote because no one on the board liked mess mid-meeting. They preferred a clear field, deny variances, then impose fines. I needed to break that rhythm. I called attention, quietly, to the conflict between the old style sheet and current postal guidance. Not on social channels, not in the crowd. I sent a written note to the management company to attach to my variance file. For clarity, USPS wall-mounted mailbox guidance updated. Current placement and slot size now align with safety and accessibility. See attached excerpt. That excerpt highlighted the height and accessibility line. It was dry, which made it potent. It asked the board to weigh safety and practicality against a dead swatch. The purists doubled down in the meantime. They circulated a new tally, this time with a column labeled Defiance Risk. I saw it on a phone screen outside the mail kiosk, where a few owners gathered pretending to sort envelopes. A gust of warm air lifted the corner of someone's stack. A faint metallic creak came from the kiosk door. The word defiance did more for my resolve than any rallying call could. If wanting the association to follow its own paperwork made me defiant, I would carry that label like a tool belt. On July 29th, a pre-hearing notice appeared in the portal for a handful of addresses, mine included. It claimed that failure to rectify by August 1st could result in a $450 fine on August 2nd. The number was now inked. The could was a formality. The board preferred certainty disguised as process. I pressed my hand against the brick column and felt the heat from the afternoon sun still in it. The brick, the lid curve, the tag. They were props and show, but they were also my proof. I had matched our origin story better than the purest polished favorites. As the special session loomed, I set up my own demonstration in plain sight. On my porch table, I laid out the archival photo, the footnoted style sheet, the compliance sweep memo, and my variance request clipped neatly in order. I added a printout of the USPS guidance. While I didn't invite passers-by to study it, I didn't hide it either. Neighbors paused. Some nodded. A few took a photo. The visor passed by at dusk, tightened their jaw, and moved on. The special session day arrived with heat pressing down like a dome. The board tabled a meeting in the clubhouse with pitchers of water, neat stacks of packets, and a perfumed hint of old carpet in the air. I attended as a member, quiet in a chair along the wall, variance copy in my lap. The treasurer opened with numbers. The vice president recited rules. The president asked for efficient progress. They wanted the script to run smooth. Deny, vote, mail. The committee chair presented the tally like an achievement. She framed it as a preservation effort, then rationed the details. She never mentioned the footnote. She never mentioned the memo sentence about variances due to manufacturer availability. She described a drift toward a market stall look, a phrase so dramatic it cracked the room for a second. A ceiling vent hummed like a soft reminder to keep breathing. When the board turned to variances, my file landed on the table with a colored tab, Priority. The liaison summarized my request. The treasurer frowned at the archival photo, then at the footnote. He asked a question about the vendor being defunct, without addressing me, since owners weren't invited to speak on variances in that session. The management rep confirmed the vendor's status and noted the memo's language on practicability. The vice president shifted to risk. If they granted one variance, would they unleash dozens? The liaison pointed to my narrow framing. Archival design only, match in finish and placement, documented against the association's own photos. The president asked for council's guidance. Translated. Were they exposed if they denied a variance that fit their own written flexibility? The council rep, present via printed note, had already answered in general terms. Where exact match is unavailable, board should exercise discretion to allow substantially similar replacements consistent with record and safety. That phrase, consistent with record, was my through line. Record meant the photos they themselves shared. Record meant the memo. Record meant the footnote. I had tied each strand together, and now it sat in their hands. The vote didn't happen for variances that night. The president punted the issue to further review with design subcommittee, but she also froze fines for any addresses with active variance requests. That freeze covered me and a handful of others who had followed my paper trail. The purists didn't get their clean sweep. They got a pause. Pauses can become pivots. The board just kicked my $450 fine into a freeze, but freeze isn't a win. If the treasurer pushes to recoup losses next week, that pause penalty could balloon into stacked fees unless I turn their own records into a new standard before the clock restarts. The committee chair looked deflated as the session ended. The visor left early. The members along the wall exhaled. Outside, the night air felt a few degrees cooler, or maybe that was just the pressure dropping. I walked home under the soft wash of streetlights, replaying the council note in my head. Consistent with record. If they were going to escape this without embarrassment, they needed a path to update Section 4.3. with a living style palette. I could write the first draft of that path and hand it to them like a bridge. The next week was full of mixed messages. The management portal issued fine freeze notices for variance addresses, while generic reminder pinged everyone else to rectify by August 1st. The purists celebrated in their circle, claiming the freeze was a mere speed bump and that the fine would land on August 2nd as planned. Plan was doing a lot of work in that sentence. My mailbox kept its tag and my binder kept growing. Before anything else, I wrote a short proposal, the kind the board could copy and pretend they wrote. Amendment to CCR Section 4.3, Mailbox Style Sheet Clarification. It listed 3 finished options that matched the dead swatch's look, 2 current manufacturers with similar dimensions, and an archival curve option limited to models documented in the association's own photos from the early years. I framed it as preservation by documentation, not by nostalgia. I attached side-by-side photos and the memo excerpt acknowledging availability constraints. I submitted it through the portal and hand-delivered a copy to the management office's Dropbox, date stamped July 31st. At noon that day, a mass email titled Status Update. Fixtures Review went out. It repeated much of the memo, but a new line stood out. Variance requests referencing archival materials will be reviewed in the next design subcommittee meeting. That was either my echo or coincidence. Either way, it put the visor's tally on hold for another week. I heard the faint click of a distant sprinkler and let out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. The visor's tally led to tags and July 25th notice pointing toward a $450 fine on August 2nd, but the board froze fines for active variances after I documented an archival match and the practicable footnote. I've now handed them a ready-made clarification to Section 4.3. If they adopt it, their own process shifts from punishment to preservation. With the freeze in place, the purists pivoted to a different tactic: public shaming. They started photographing tag columns and posting before montages, framing us as a problem. They recorded the number of days each tag remained, turning time into an accusation. The photos made our brick columns look like mugshots. It stung, even when I knew the game. Shame is a fast tool. It doesn't fix anything. It just sticks to people. I decided to counter with something the purists could not measure into submission: history. In the association storage crawlspace behind the clubhouse kitchen, there were boxes of old newsletters and event flyers. As a former committee member years ago, I still had access during office hours. I signed the log, lifted a dusty lid, and found what I needed: early photos from the first 3 years of Alder Row, including a street shot where half the mailboxes had the same gentle curve as mine. I scanned 2 spreads on the clubhouse copier and emailed them to the design subcommittee inbox with a plain subject line: archival reference, mailbox lids, years 1 to 3. I didn't stop there. I created an annotated one-pager, 3 photos, arrows marking the curve, a caption reading documented street appearance, consistent with brand identity described in early brochures. I attached the page to my variance file. No heat, no drama, just receipts. If the board wanted to present a clarification that satisfied both their safety concern and their preservation language, this was the piece that let them claim victory without admitting defeat. If that sounds like an HOA revenge story disguised as help, that's because sometimes the cleanest revenge is making your opponent adopt your plan as if it were their own. To keep the momentum, I walked the loop again at sunset. The air smelled like watered soil, and cicadas fell into a slower rhythm. A handful of tags had been removed after owners hurried through fixes. A handful remained, mine included. Neighbors gave small nods. The visor stood near the entrance monument, talking with the chair, gesturing toward a folded list. She pointed twice toward my row. The chair shook her head. The visor tightened her visor, if that's even possible, and marched away. A breeze carried the faintest chime from someone's porch decor, a tiny derailment of their script. The August 1st deadline arrived with no new letter. Instead, the portal updated my variance status to under design review, fines held. This wasn't a win, not yet. The treasurer posted a line in the meeting notice hinting they'd evaluate administrative costs. Administrative costs are fines in a different suit. If they couldn't catch us on style, they might try to catch us on time. Money was circling. They paused at $450, but the treasurer's administrative costs plan could convert the freeze into a rolling tab, unless I turn the board's need for order into a vote for my archival variance at the next meeting, with the advisor's own tally as proof they can't enforce the dead spec fairly. I went to bed that night with the porch light off, the tag still on the brick, and my binder on the table, open to the one-pager that showed our street's original curve. Tomorrow, I'd press that page into the record in front of the committee, then the board. If they wanted uniformity, they'd have to define it honestly, with their own photos and their own footnotes. If they wanted fees, they have to explain why a member who met their practicable standards should subsidize an obsolete style sheet. The path was set. Now I had to walk it cleanly. Retaliation, for me, wasn't fire. It was paperwork with teeth. The design subcommittee opened public comment for 5 minutes at the start of their meeting, and I used every second to place the records already in their hands into a single through line. The archival curve visible in the association's own photos, the practicable footnote that recognized supplier extinction, the compliant sweep memo acknowledging variances when exact matches weren't available, and the USPS guidance that made the old height spec untenable. I didn't plead. I connected dots they had authored. When I sat down, the room felt different, like the air after a drawer finally slides open. The visors group tried to pivot. They handed out a fresh tally marked with red stars where defiance had persisted past August 1st. The sight of those stars worked on nerves more than facts. Shame travels faster than memos. But the records were not on their side anymore. The treasurer, who loves neat math, had to square the cost of sending letters that might be reversed against a council note that encouraged discretion grounded in the record. I had given them record. I had given them a bridge. If they deny the variance now, counsel consistent with record language becomes a legal consequence they don't want to explain in the next open meeting. So the same tally that fueled the purge could force an about-face. The subcommittee adjourned to deliberate. While they did, I set my own small stage outside, 3 enlarged photos mounted on foam board. Year 1 lived with the same gentle curve, my current box next to the dead swatch, and the memo sentence highlighted where even a quick glance could read it. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't need to. People studied the boards, then looked at the visor's red stars, then back at my boards. A midsummer breeze moved the clubhouse flag, just enough to make a soft fabric hiss. The retaliation had a second layer, money redirected. The treasurer's hint about administrative costs sounded like a tab they intended to run up if fines were frozen. I preempted that by proposing a pooled fixture review workshop paid from the discretionary education fund, already budgeted and barely used. That fund covers seminars about landscaping and reserve planning. It can cover a 1-hour session where the board explains a clarified style sheet and cites the archival record. If they adopt my workshop idea, the association pays to educate rather than punish, and administrative costs become a line item they want to spend anyway. It's amazing how fast the fee threat evaporates when it threatens the same budget you brag about balancing. I filed the workshop proposal and copied the treasurer. 2 neighbors who'd followed my paper trail filed similar variance requests anchored to the same archival images. We weren't an army. We were a well-labeled folder. The management company likes well-labeled folders. I walked the row at dusk, the smell of warm brick and watered soil rising off the ground. Some tags had been peeled by owners trying to avoid photos. Mine remained. It felt less like a scarlet letter now and more like a placeholder before a sign change. I could picture the day it would be replaced by a small notice with different wording. Variance granted, archival design. I let that picture steady my steps. Climax day came to the regular board meeting, not the special session. A small but important tell. Big changes happen when there's a quorum of ordinary members. It spreads ownership and dilutes blame. The president put mailbox clarification, CCR section 4.3 mid-agenda. The secretary read a short preamble about preserving character while acknowledging supply realities and compliance with postal guidance. Then the design subcommittee chair, no visor, just a binder, introduced a motion. Adopt the clarification I had written, nearly word for word, including the archival curve option limited to models documented in association materials, plus 2 currently available finishes that match the dead swatch to naked eye. A pause rolled through the room. The treasurer asked whether adoption would impact any pending fines or administrative costs. The management rep answered that all addresses with archival variances would be deemed compliant under the clarification and released from pending penalties, and that education funds could host a single session to guide replacements without cost recovery. The vice president, who had fretted about floodgates, asked that the clarification preserve uniformity. The chair said yes, because it tightened options while acknowledging reality. The archival path was narrow by design and required documentation from the association's record. The council note, consistent with record, sat on the table like a lighthouse beam. The visor wasn't at the microphone. She sat 3 rows back, arms folded so tightly her elbows touched. Her tally never appeared on the screen. The tally had done its job already. First as a cudgel, then as the demonstration of selective enforcement the board did not want on video. When the president called the vote, hands rose around the dais. The motion passed with 1 abstention from the committee chair, who preferred the old dead catalog. The room did not clap. HOA rooms rarely do. But the relief sounded like the soft exhale you hear when a stuck window finally slides open. I watched the board move to the next item and felt a quiet ridge inside me settle. The laminated tag on my brick would come down. The $450 fine dated August 2nd would never be assessed. The administrative cost tab died stillborn, and the visor's grand list of rogues had just become, by the board's own adoption, a list of compliant neighbors. A minute later, the president added a final instruction, small in words, large in effect. She directed the committee to suspend public tag photography and disallow tally posting outside official minutes. Shame theater was over. The room's hum returned to ordinary business, a faint buzz from the light grid, papers shifting, pens tapping. I didn't smile. I filed the sound in my memory next to the word practicable. The vote is a win, but the visor's camp will hunt for reputational payback. Before they can spin a new story, I'm going to use their own tally to draft a compliance map that shows how many rogues were always within the association's archival brand, turning their scoreboard into my receipt. The management portal updated 2 hours later. My variance status changed to approved archival clarification, and a message invited all owners to the workshop I propose, now framed as style clarification Q&A. The notice used neutral tone, but a single line stood out. Courtesy tags will be removed as files are updated. It didn't say rectified. It said updated. 1 word, 1 entire pivot. Aftermath arrived in 3 waves. First, the physical. A maintenance tech came by in the afternoon heat and peeled my laminated tag with slow, careful pull that left a pale rectangle for the sun to even out. He tossed the tag into a small trash bag that already held a handful of others. The porch smelled faintly of warm adhesive for a minute, then carried the ordinary sense of mulch and cut grass. Without the tag, the column looked like brick again, not a bulletin board. Second, the social. The visor circle went quiet in public. No more stars on a tally. No more before montages. A few of the purists looked through me on the sidewalk, which is another way of admitting they see me clearly. Neighbors who had hung back began to ask about the archival option without speaking in a whisper. People like Comfort, and Comfort had shifted sides. Third, the record. The board posted the clarification text. It read as if it had been there all along, written in that HOA neutral language that erases fingerprints. It cited CCR section 4.3, the practicable standard, the archival photographs contained in association publications, and the USPS height/access guidance. It mentioned that designs must be substantially similar to those records and listed the 2 current finishes. It even attached a tiny grayscale of the year 1 lid curve. That attachment was my favorite part, not because it credited me, it didn't, but because it made the association narrate its own memory. You can't enforce nostalgia. You can only document it. I thought the visor would find new front. People like lists always do. Instead, she withdrew to smaller circles where the word standards still had power. The committee chair shifted tone and began to speak like a curator rather than a cop. The treasurer, relieved to have a clean spreadsheet again, backed the workshop and moved on to reserves. The president never mentioned the episode on video, which is how presidents keep their chairs. And me? I put the foam boards back into my bed, slid the binder onto the shelf, and stood on the porch to look at a brick column that now said, in its own quiet way, that records matter more than one person's map of shame. I won't pretend there was no cost. Weeks of attention and a steady hum of adrenaline leave a mark. For a place meant to feel like home, an HOA can turn your threshold into a border checkpoint in a heartbeat. Boundaries aren't just lines between lots. They're the lines between authority and autonomy. This time, the line moved towards sanity because the association chose documentation over display. No one apologized. They rarely do. But the maintenance tech's careful peel, the removal of public tagging, and the adopted clarification added up to something better than an apology: precedent. The next time a dead spec collides with real life, someone else can pull a binder off a shelf and find the sentence that unlocks the window. In one line, tell me your mailbox style committee horror from home.